Hey there, hello again. How nice to have everyone congregate together halfway through the day. If we haven't already met, I am Tricia Patterson, the 2021 NDSA DigiPres Program Chair, and I hope you all have been enjoying yourself so far today. I'm delighted to introduce our keynote address given by Dr. Tonia Sutherland. Dr. Sutherland is an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and her research focuses on the entanglements between memory, community, and technology. She's also the author of the book Digital Remains, which is forthcoming from the University of California Press. She is beaming into your screens from Honolulu, Hawaii, so she's been generously flexible with her time and joining us live during our program today despite our time differential. So without further ado, I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Sutherland for her talk, After the Archives, on Living and Dying in Digital Culture.
Warmest greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Tonia Sutherland, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Information and Computer Sciences at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where my work focuses on archival studies, digital studies, and science and technology studies. It's an honor to be here with you all today at the National Digital Stewardship Alliance's Digital Preservation 2021 conference, which is being held in concert with CLEAR's DLF Forum and Learn DLF. I'm especially excited by this year's DigiPres theme, Embracing Digitality. Before I go any further, I'd like to take a moment to note that I am joining you from Honolulu, Hawaii, where I am a guest and uninvited visitor on the unceded Aina of the Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian people. I would also like to take a moment to call upon the grace and guidance of my Afro-Caribbean ancestors from Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Lucia, as I do this work with you today. Today, I want to spend some time addressing three of the main questions posed by the conference organizers. First, how does the advancement of digitality expand the landscape of possibilities for people, systems, the environment, and the world? Second, what opportunities have we gained and what must we be wary of losing? And finally, how can we best position our profession to embrace digitality and intentionally develop strategies, tools, and practices that move us forward as a community? My responses to these questions today will be based on meditations from my forthcoming monograph, Digital Remains, Race and the Digital Afterlife, which tracks the ways the deaths of Black people in the United States have been commodified from the analog era through the digital era, and offers a nuanced study of both historical and contemporary archives and record-keeping practices. It is my goal in our brief time together to articulate some contemporary conceptions of what it means to live and die in our increasingly data-intensive digital culture, and to speak to some concerns about how digitality is experienced in and often weaponized against Black communities. To address the first question of expanded landscapes, I'm going to ask us to think about the historical record and to ask some hard questions about the new digital afterlives of analog records. To think through what we may have gained and about what we may have to lose, I'll offer some examples of embodied records and how digital resurrection and digital immortality practices have both changed how we might interact with the dead in digital environments, and how these practices raise new concerns about the loss of voice and agency. Finally, to address how we can best position ourselves professionally to embrace digitality, I will speak to notions of refusal and sovereignty and how these practices actually offer a collective way forward in uneven and unequal digital settings. The Lillenquist family of Civil War photographs at the Library of Congress comprise more than 3,000 ambrotype and tintype special portraits and carte de visite that document both the Union and the Confederacy during the American Civil War. Among the carte de visite is an 1863 image depicting a shirtless man seated sideways in his chair with his back to the camera. His face is in profile, his left hand resting on his hip with his elbow out to the side, accentuating the shape of his muscular back. His back, meant to be the focal point of the image, is covered in a spidery network of thick, knotted keloid scars. Printed on verso are the words "From Life," taken at Baton Rouge, Louisiana, April 2nd, 1863. Also on verso is a hand-scrawled note to one Colonel L.B. Marsh from J.W. Mercer, assistant surgeon with the 47th Massachusetts Volunteers at Camp Parapet, Louisiana, that reads, "I have found a large number of the 400 contrabands examined by me to be as badly lacerated as the specimen represented in the enclosed photograph." In November 2015, a nearly identical carte de visite dated 12 April 1863 was sold by Boston-based auction house company Skinner Auctioneers for just under $8,000 for $7,995. On verso, this card displays typescript text on a separate piece of paper attached to the card's surface. And an ink stamp tells us that this albumin image is the work of photographer A.I. Blovelt of Port Hudson, Louisiana. The typed text reads, "10 days from today, I left the plantation. Overseer Carrier whipped me. I was 2 months in bed sore from the whipping. My master come after I was whipped. He discharged the overseer. My master was not present. I don't remember the whipping. I was 2 months in bed sore from the whipping, and my sense began to come. I was sort of crazy. I tried to shoot everybody. They said so. I do not know. I did not know that I had attempted to shoot everyone. They told me so. I burned up all my clothes, but I don't remember that. I was never this way, crazy, before. I don't know what made me come this way, crazy. My master come after I was whipped, saw me in bed. He discharged the overseer. They told me I attempted to shoot my wife, the first one. I did not shoot anyone. I did not harm anyone. My master's Captain John Lyon, cotton planter on Atchafalaya near Washington, Louisiana, whipped 2 months before Christmas." The very words of poor Peter taken as he sat for this picture. This text is the documented written record of oral testimony given by Gordon, known as also as Peter, as he was photographed during a medical examination conducted in April 1863 by a Union Army doctor near Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Gordon, the man whose image appears on these two archival carte de visite, was an enslaved man who self-emancipated in March 1863 from a plantation in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, after having barely survived the savage beating that produced the scars that crisscrossed his back. Gordon reported the 10-day journey on foot from St. Landry Parish to Baton Rouge to be a perilous one. He was barefoot, had been chased by John Lyons along with several neighbors and a pack of bloodhounds, and was in dire fear for his life. When he reached the Union Army encampment along the Mississippi River, his clothes were torn and covered with dirt and mud from his long and harrowing trek through Louisiana's swamps and bayous. At the encampment, where Gordon was subsequently mustered into military service, the Union Army conducted a surgical examination, at which time Gordon's scourged back was observed and photographed by two itinerant photographers, William D. McPherson and his partner, Mr. Oliver of New Orleans. The photograph of Gordon, which has come to be known as the scourged back, sometimes also referred to as whipped Peter, which I will not and have not reproduced here, was reproduced as a popular carte de visite in the American North and widely circulated as evidence of both slavery's cruelty and American racism, particularly as experienced in the American South. On Saturday, July 4th, 1863, the scourged back portrait and two others of Gordon, including the one that is presented here, appeared as wood engravings as a special Indigenous Day feature in Harper's Weekly, paired with a brief narrative about Gordon. McPherson and Oliver's portrait of Gordon, presented alongside Gordon's narrative, was well received, and photography studios throughout the American North began to duplicate and sell prints of the scourged back. Within months, the carte de visite of Gordon had become an early example of what would eventually become the wide dissemination and circulation, particularly among white Americans in the North, of ideologically abolitionist photographs depicting what they argued were the social ills of human enslavement. Among Black abolitionists, however, including Frederick Douglass, who had also self-emancipated, a different narrative emerged. Black abolitionists like Douglass argued that while photographs and other images might serve to demonstrate the fundamental humanity of enslaved Black people and subvert anti-Black racism, seductive new technologies such as photography should not be a means of documenting the brutality of one's previously enslaved condition. Rather, photography might be better employed as a means of making politically minded abolitionist points about the individual humanity of Black people. Although Douglass insisted that those who were enslaved be seen as people, this demand for a fundamentally human gaze was never fully realized, even among Northern white abolitionists who were ostensibly using such photographs toward noble and moral ends. The visceral image of Gordon's scarred back was in fact quickly appropriated by white abolitionists who, in circulating the photograph, described Gordon using phraseology such as displaying unusual intelligence and energy, and as demonstrated by the carte de visite in the Lillenquist family collection at the Library of Congress, terminology such as contraband and specimen in their ever virtuous attempts to reconcile the willful violence in the image with declarations about Gordon's apparently surprising humanity. And although the photograph of Gordon is itself a powerful visual testimony to the brutality of American slavery, as is evidenced by the inclusion of Gordon's oral testimony on the Skinner carte de visite, emancipated people who had been enslaved were perfectly capable of testifying on their own behalf. Instead, however, it was the white gaze, a position of privilege characterized by power and authority, often acquired through brute force, that determined which of these testimonies was to be imbued with enduring sociocultural value. The same power relations to which Gordon was himself subjected under the conditions of enslavement were subsequently embedded in the visual display of his tortured Black body. The scourged back image of Gordon, like all visual depictions of Black people in pejorative poses, particularly when viewed through the lens of whiteness, is one that is simultaneously objectifying and disconnected from the realities of Gordon's actual personhood and identity. As a result, Gordon himself disappears in this trauma narrative. He is dehumanized and disarticulated, conferred to the annals of history as little more than a tortured Black body. That white abolitionists perceived a need to use individual portrayals of Black trauma to make other white people appreciate the expansive brutalities of human enslavement is enough offense on its face, frankly, but that this white gaze project was ultimately a political rather than a humanizing one is even more so. For archives and for those who use them, digitization is often presented as a panacea for problems of archival preservation and access. The laudable aim of such digitization projects is to make archival materials more accessible to the general public via the internet. Physical access to the carte de visite of Gordon in the Library of Congress, for example, is restricted by the library. One may view the original image by appointment only. Instead, digital access to the image is provided via the library's prints and photographs online collection, where, per LOC, the image is easier to see than the original carte de visite, and viewers can manipulate the digital image, zooming in for detail or out for perspective. The library also notes that the digital images are used in preference to the original carte de visite as an archival preservation measure. The original item is, as one might expect, quite fragile, and repeated handling puts it at risk for irreparable damage. Providing broad access to digitized artifacts and even their preservation, however, especially in the longer term, is oftentimes problematic. These problems, when they arise, are not only technological, they are also economic, political, legal, and moral. While as art historian Temi Odumosu has argued, now digitized artifacts and documents have come to represent their own forms of remembrance and are in general positively viewed as the means through which access to out of reach and or decaying collections can be brokered, digital technologies and the new artifacts they produce can themselves also be seen as a form of cultural imperialism that supports racialized hegemony and often results in distinct expressions of anti-Blackness. Indeed, in her article, The Crying Child, Odumosu uses a single photograph of a crying Afro-Caribbean child from St. Croix that was digitized by the Royal Danish Library to demonstrate the unresolved ethical matters that retrospective attempts to understand human enslavement in the digital era present. Like the image of Gordon, Odumosu correctly asserts that this photograph suspends in time a Black body, clearly in visible distress, with a running nose and copious tears rolling down its face. She further argues that because all the natural and affecting sounds of a child's cry are muted via the photographic lens onto the paper, and still further in the digital image, the pregnant silence one experiences in encounters with this photograph across media is particularly arresting. The initial camera silenced the cry. Thus, it is what we cannot hear that marks the violations taking place in and around this image. And we need to perform a bone-deep listening, a sensing of the unbridgeable chasm to fully access this seen cry unheard. So while digitization has undeniably provided a range of new innovations for viewing and experiencing historical records, including 3D scanning, 360-degree photography, optical character recognition or OCR, the digitization and datafication of the archives of Atlantic slavery has arguably also contributed to a distancing of the lived experiences of enslaved people from what might be described as slavery's historical imaginary. When slavery era records are digitized, these records appear and circulate in different contexts, further exacerbating the already significant temporal gap between the violence of the past and the visual experience of the present. The visual experiences of Gordon's scourged back or Odumosu's crying child, isolated in a Google image search, for example, are far removed from the contexts of their lived experiences. A harrowing and painful, life-threatening journey during which Gordon carried himself on foot towards self-emancipation, or the tears of a frightened child. This decontextualization removes the immediacy of trauma and gives archival documents that record that trauma new digital afterlives, as those visual records are read and experienced in the present, dislocated and often disassociated from the human suffering that produced them. So too do digital technologies that aim to extend digitality, the experience of living in digital culture for those who have passed on. In July of this year, Rolling Stone published an article titled "Whitney Houston's Hologram is Coming to Las Vegas," noting that following its 2020 tour in the United Kingdom, the hologram show was given approval from Houston's estate to play Harrah's Las Vegas for a 6-month engagement. The hologram show, An Evening with Whitney, the Whitney Houston Hologram Concert, created by Base Hologram Productions in partnership with the Houston estate, debuted in early 2020 and was scheduled to open in Las Vegas before COVID-19 shut down the entertainment industry. The show, which features holograms of Houston from various stages of her career, alongside real-life backup singers, dancers, and musicians, is reminiscent for many of the hologram of Tupac Shakur that was unveiled at Coachella in 2012. There are many who tout the promise of these new technologies to extend life and liberate humanity from the inevitability of death. In the United States, however, where a strong argument can be made that the prison industrial complex is a transparent extension of chattel slavery, and where the overuse of incarceration has created a social inequality that has prevented Black Americans from fully participating in American life, I'd like to argue that for Black Americans, digital resurrection might also be thought of as a compulsory post-mortem enslavement, or as keenly demonstrated in the Black Museum episode of Black Mirror, a kind of post-mortem carceral conscription. From an archives and records standpoint, archival scholar Randall C. Jimerson theorizes three different kinds of collecting institutions: the temple, the prison, and the restaurant. While temple institutions are defined as collecting institutions where the archivist preserves the original interpretation of items or collections, restaurant institutions, by contrast, are institutions where the archivist guides the user, allowing them to make their own decisions and allowing the collection and items to speak for themselves. In prison institutions, however, the archivist serves only the interpretations of an oppressive higher power. So if we consider the Whitney Houston and Tupac holograms as embodied records, they are of the type that belong to the carceral archives of Jimerson's prison institutions. Similarly, legacy chatbot programs, which function by using advanced computing algorithms and access to a range of digital records of the person they are simulating, including Twitter posts, Facebook posts, text messages, Fitbit data, and more, are becoming increasingly popular. As the Wall Street Journal reported in July, researchers in artificial intelligence are working to digitally reanimate people, not only as the static replicas for the benefit of their loved ones, but as evolving digital entities that may steer companies or influence world events. Earlier this year, a man named Joshua Barbeau, writing for the San Francisco Chronicle, detailed how he used artificial intelligence to simulate a conversation between his dead fiancée and himself. While technology has not yet advanced enough to create chatbots that resemble specific people with complete accuracy, there are several companies such as Eternomy, Replica, and Luca that are working really hard to perfect it. Eternomy, for example, is allowing interested customers to sign up for their services now and provide an ongoing data stream to the company via its website so that when death does occur, the company will have all of the data it needs to create a, quote, carbon copy of the consumer in the future. Now that the technology is catching up with the idea, people will increasingly be able to communicate with their deceased friends and relatives. I argue that these holograms and legacy chatbots serve a carceral narrative, one that is beholden to commercial interests, souvenir and fetish cultures, othering, spectacle, and whiteness as higher powers, as oppressive powers. Digital Whitney and digital Tupac are carceral artifacts imprisoned by the archives of folklore and of longing, and digitally incarcerated by white supremacy's need to possess and control Black people's bodies. As Simone Brown argues, this is what happens when certain kinds of bodies are rendered as digitized code through technologies such as facial recognition, iris and retinal scans, hand geometry, fingerprint templates, vascular patterns, gait, and other kinesthetic recognition, and increasingly DNA. All of these ultimately treat the body as evidence that supersede individuals' accounts of who they are and whether and where they belong. Noah de Lissavoy has argued that one central expression of neoliberal culture is an emphasis on the state's carceral functions, what he calls the carceral turn. I would argue that in digital resurrection and digital immortality practices, digital culture has taken a sharp carceral turn, one in which Black people's bodies are imprisoned by emerging technologies and often in the service of white supremacy. In the spirit of Black joy, I will offer that I would prefer to position digitally resurrected Whitney Houston and the hologram of Tupac Shakur as celebrations of Black thought and righteous refusal, refusing to be defined by how they died. But Whitney Houston and Tupac Shakur are dead. Perhaps they have been reconstituted and resurrected, but they have not been reincarnated by the digital. They do not get a second chance at life. Rather, their deaths have been co-opted and commercialized. Pat Houston, Whitney's sister, has said of the hologram, "While Whitney is no longer with us, her voice and legacy will live on with us forever. An evening with Whitney is another chance for us to relive and celebrate the talent that we were so lucky to receive for more than 3 decades, and we're excited to bring this cutting-edge musical experience to the fans who supported the pop culture phenomenon that was Whitney Houston, because they deserve nothing less." But what does Whitney deserve? What does Tupac deserve? They themselves no longer enjoy agency over their digital remains, the digital traces that they left behind. Whitney and Tupac are dead. They retain no rights to how they are represented in death, no rights to refuse misrepresentation. And so now I'd like to spend the last bit of our time together considering conflicting concerns about our rights and responsibilities in the face of new digital afterlife practices. The extension of analog records into the digital and the subsequent removal of context exacerbate the inability of digital subjects to construct their own agency, reality, or representation in the present. Although digital archives have the potential to create what Homi Bhabha might call third spaces, in which, for example, descendants of enslaved people might have more control over their ancestral materials and records, working with those records in the present ought to compel us to stop and consider, for example, the ways that privacy is racialized and often afforded only as a condition of whiteness. These considerations position us to begin reckoning with disparate and often conflicting cultural positions on notions of archival and digital sovereignty, ownership, and access. An instance of digital permanence occurs whenever documentary evidence and bystander documentation reach the internet. The internet, as archivists understand perhaps better than anyone else, is forever, except when you want it to be. Duplication, migration, backups, data storage, and a host of other data curation and information management practices ensure that even if something is taken down from the internet, it is never actually gone or deleted. It always leaves a digital trace, and there are usually locally held duplicates as well as general copies. This has led to a set of compelling questions that I believe archivists and archival studies scholars must start asking. Do Black people have the right to decide how we will be remembered? Do we have the right to be forgotten? Do we have the right to separate how we died from how we lived? Where is the line between memorialization and commodification? Where is the line between documentation and fetishization? And what is the archivist's role in defining ethical data practices, documenting human rights abuses, securing privacy, and laying bare inequality and injustice in an uncertain future replete with digital remains? There is marked tension here between memorialization, the right to be remembered, and increasing desire, and yes, even need, for technological and digital forgetting. As I have worked with colleagues over the past several years to develop the Feminist Data Manifest No, I can't help but think that inclusion in spaces that are trying to destroy you should not be a goal toward which one is working. Do we have the right to refuse to be represented in the archives? What does it mean to exercise rights of refusal in documentary spaces where our survival was never guaranteed or even desired? Rather than trying to fit into systems that are not made for us, what would it mean for Black archival subjects to articulate and practice the feminist art of saying no? To assert sovereignty over our bodies, both in life and death, in the analog and the digital. Digital or data sovereignty is the idea that data is subject to the laws and information governance mandated by the nation in which the data is collected. Data sovereignty is typically discussed in two ways. The first is in relation to Indigenous groups and Indigenous autonomy from colonial states. The second is in relation to the transnational flow of data, and I think both definitions are useful here. Developments in the European Union have highlighted the potential need for a universal online right to be forgotten. The right to be forgotten in its current incarnation is the application of a more general right of erasure under the EU Data Protection Directive of 1995. a directive that applies to search engines as well as any organization that controls and processes EU consumer data. Individuals in the EU have the right to request that data controllers remove personal data if the information is inaccurate, inadequate, irrelevant, or excessive. Over the past 2 decades or so, many countries have passed various laws around control and storage of data, which all reflect measures of data sovereignty. Of these laws, Europe's GDPR is probably the most well-known, oft-cited, and most adored by the tech industry. The GDPR aims primarily to give control to individuals over their personal data and to simplify the regulatory environment for international business by standardizing how non-EU nations deal with EU citizens' personal data. Generally speaking, under the rules of the GDPR, data workers must clearly disclose any data collection, declare the lawful basis and purpose for data processing, state how long the data is being retained, and specify if the data is being shared with third parties. The right to privacy, to digital autonomy and sovereignty in the United States, however, is intrinsically linked to whiteness, which is to say that Black people do not enjoy the same rights to privacy in the digital sphere that whiteness affords. Gordon, for example, does not enjoy the right to be forgotten, nor can he separate how he lived from how he died. Gordon does not get to say no. He has no rights of refusal. He can issue no takedown order for the image of his scourged back. If these terms seem to have no relationship to your day-to-day practice or scholarship, I will leave you with this very practical example. When you digitize records that depict violence or trauma, giving these records new digital afterlives, the people resurrected through digitization do not enjoy a right to be forgotten. And as I have argued in other settings, too often, archivists also uncritically recreate harmful descriptive and other professional practices through simple transfer from the analog to the digital. What is perhaps most compelling to me in this ongoing research is that the archival permanence that burdens Black people's bodies specifically, because there is no right to refusal, no digital sovereignty. It begs the question of how these ordinary and extraordinary Black people lived, how they died, how they are remembered, how their digital remains are constituted, and what happens to those digital remains. It leaves those things forever intimately linked to systemic and structural practices of anti-Black and often state-sponsored violence, a violence that is too frequently reinscribed and reified in, and also justified by, the archival record. I argue that if you want to honor Black lives, you must also let us rest in peace. In communities of color, there may be tremendous social capital involved in both the capture and the widespread distribution of records. Most often created by community members for a common good, they are part of a socially networked system of reclaiming, bearing witness, and producing evidence. We know that if we want to see justice, we must reclaim the data as our tool. It is vitally important that we not only structure new narratives from that data, but that we address the silences, the gaps, and the vagaries in that data and demand to have a say in how data about us is used, lest we be reduced to digital objects, reduced only to our digital remains. I invite all of you to join us. Thank you.